Welcome back. This is Daybreak, and thank you for staying with us. The hashtag on X is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422. At Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir, President William Ruto, ever since coming to power in September, has had passionate call for climate, the equity in terms of financing, and the consequences the continent continues to pay. Here is one of the speeches the president made, and in regards to the repositioning of the African continent in line with the achievements that are made after the climate conferences, especially in the context of the 2021, 2022 and 23, which happened last in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates.
We today are very proud that Africa is no longer the continent that was viewed just as a mere victim of climate change. That today, we are repositioning Africa as the continent that has the largest potential of renewable energy, and that we can use this potential, transform it into opportunity, and change it into investment that will give not just an Africa green industrialization trajectory, but it will also create opportunities for employment, opportunities for industrialization that will eventually create enough jobs and stop our young people from migrating using rickety instruments in dangerous voyages to the rest of the world.
Helen, talk then to me about this repositioning that he talks about and the move away from victimhood to a continent of opportunity.
So first of all, we need to look at how do we move away from the fossil fuels. And I want to give a clarion call to all our leaders that they need to be firm and stand against the scramble for oil and gas in Africa, because a lot of the time we see that a wealthier nation come and, entice us with that, look, if you want to develop, and a faster development will need that you extract your oil, you extract your gas. But as our president rightly mentioned, there is huge potential of renewable energy, not just in Kenya, but across the continent of Africa. So we need to get to a point where we are investing more in that. We need to, divest funds from, oil and gas, fossil fuels, and put more emphasis on renewable energy. We have, a good example here in Kenya, such as the Turkana wind farm, powering every seventh bulb, in our homes and everywhere else. So why don't we put a lot of our resources into that? And in that, then we are able to also ensure that we have energy access even to the communities, because one of the challenges here is the issue about energy access. You find that as much as we're saying, well, we're moving towards, we want to explore fossil fuel because we want more to create more energy. It's not trickling down to the communities that really need this. So let's invest more into renewables energy. But more than that, we also need the polluters to, take responsibility for all the damages that they've paid, they have caused. So polluters need to pay, but more also, apart from polluters paying, we have what we call a common but differentiated responsibility. Okay. So as we are calling upon the wealthier nations to up the financial support, we also call upon the other nations as well. So it's all about collective responsibility. So people coming together to ensure that we are making this transition a possibility. Okay.
Dr. Koimburi, the repositioning the head of state talked about, and the subsequent creation of jobs through investments, industrialization. The question is then, how can this happen? How will it happen?
Yeah. I think the direction that the president was looking at is in terms of green jobs. And as I was saying earlier, I'll be going back to the Kenya private sector in that green jobs is the way to move. And I think those are some of the biggest fears that most of the key players have. When you look at a case scenario of South Africa, where they have the largest coal industries, most of the locals who are depending on it believe that once they shift away from coal into green renewable energy, they will lose jobs. But what they have not been educated on is that there is more opportunity in the green energy space. In fact, there will not be enough to fill those spaces. So what we are looking at is more sensitization is needed on board. And I want to say the government has played a key role, especially when it comes to ensuring that the dollar rate comes to a level where the investors now can build more confidence, can actually come in. Because when you're talking about even this green technology, most of them, they have to be imported. And there is a tax implication. There is a value, a monetary value implicated on that. So we, as KEPSA, what we are doing is we are working with various stakeholders, especially on policy matters that touch on tax issues that will make it more friendly for these private sector bodies to import this green technology and use it here locally. Okay. Also, the dollar has played a huge role because you see where the dollar was initially, it made most of these private sectors to invest in our neighbors. But now they're coming back, and we are hoping that the measures the government is putting to continue with this so that they ensure that the environment is more conducive for the private sector. Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about climate adaptation and mitigation, you will not rule out the implementers. And these are the private sectors. When you're talking about the coal industry, that is somebody who is within a private sector. When you're talking about either plastic, because I've seen you're doing work and some good work also on plastic, of which KEPSA is doing, that is a private sector. So what we are saying is that the president is saying that we need to have a unified voice. We need to come together. We need to have that one backing. Okay. Whenever he says maybe we need to move this way in terms of a green trajectory, we should not have others moving to the side by saying, no, we don't support that because we are using fossil fuel, so let's go and campaign against that. We have seen cases in foreign countries and even the global north where big companies, oil companies, they are funding campaign ads on television, on mainstream media, to derail us and to give us false narrative on climate change, that climate change is a hoax, that climate change is all this. So there is that backlash, and that's why we are saying, you as a mainstream media and for the state, we need you to continue with this good work of ensuring that you give us credible information, because these fossil fuel companies, they have a lot of money, and they're investing on media and communication and giving people communication that is wrong, so that people don't actually understand and believe that climate change is here with us and we have no other earth than this earth. Okay.
Amos, then beyond now the conferences and the boardroom meetings, let's now come down to where the consequences and the action does happen. Then we talked about the funding. We talked about how we can attain what the president talked about in terms of repositioning the continent, not as a victim certainly, but as a continent of opportunity, investments to come in, employment to be created. Then at what point do you think is very key that the civil society, businesses, the indigenous people, women, and the youth are engaged in this climate talk? And women specifically, because they bear the consequences. For example, there was an upsurge in gender-based violence when we had the drought situation in the country, because households had squeezed income, therefore all wasn't enough. And how key are these people in terms of involving them and bringing them on the table of discussion?
Yeah, the thing is, Africa has not communicated its story clearly to the world. We have a responsibility to define our story. And when you look on the continent of Africa, it's a continent that has huge opportunities. You mentioned about green industrialization. Africa has all the ingredients that are key for green industrialization. It only needs that we come together, all of us, civil society, government representatives, to develop a common agenda for the continent. For a very long time, our continent has served the interests of others. It is time for Africa to look in and serve the interests of its people. We hold 40% of global critical minerals that are necessary for the transition. But we realize that over history, Africa is only known to supply the world raw materials. When you look at energy, for example, we supply crude oil and import back refined oil at a very high rate. And that gives Africa a trade imbalance that makes it disadvantaged in the global economy. So it's time for Africa to realize its huge potential by looking inside and tapping on the potential. human resource. We have a youthful population that is able to help us build industries that are sustainable, that are able even to power the rest of the world. So Africa needs to develop a Pan-African industrial policy that will allow for value addition to our resources so that we are participating in the full value chain of be it energy, be it food system. When I came in, the president was talking about Kenya spending about 500 billion every year on food imports. Yeah. We have huge arable land. We shouldn't be depending on food imports. We have all this huge renewable energy potential. We shouldn't be depending on energy imports. Actually, we should be supplying the rest of the world these resources. But we are not organized enough to be able to do this. And that's why it needs all hands on deck, the civil society, media, and everyone, to tell an African story, a story that is going to transform this continent from a victim to being a world leader that actually Africa is.
Okay. Helen, is the question of food security also a consequence of climate change? And how can we, at our level as a country, I mean, find answers to this problem? Because, as he mentioned, there is arable land, but we're not producing enough to feed ourselves. We are depending on imports that are coming into the country, and which is not healthy for the balancing of the Kenya shilling versus other, currencies, for example, the US dollar, which is majorly used. How can this be addressed? Because it seems to be the ripple effect of what appears to be a climate talk, but also impacting what's on our tables at home. Exactly.
So what is the issue here is some of the consequences of the climate crisis that we are facing. So if you look at our food system, most of the food that we consume, for instance, here in Kenya, is coming from the smallholder farmers. Yeah. And a bulk of them depend on rain-fed agriculture. And so if we have droughts, then that means we don't have enough rains, and that at the end of the day means we don't have enough food for the country. And so we end up importing more. Yeah. I think the issue here is about getting our priorities right. If we know that we will have drought, and after drought we'll immediately have floods, then it comes back to how do we ensure that we're equipping our farmers to deal with these consequences? Because at the end of the day, it's all about ensuring that we are able to produce, whether there is a drought or there is, not enough rain. So things like ensuring that there is, sufficient water, investing in technologies that will enable them to adapt to the changing climates or the changing weather patterns. And instead of looking at how do we just ensure that there's food by, for instance, importing, from other countries, let's look at what we have inside. We have a lot of, arable land. How do we make sure that that land is able to cultivate or is able to produce as much? And the biggest issue has been, for instance, water, which, that's an issue that can quickly be solved. I always have this conversation. I'm saying 60 years after independence, we are still talking about, people dying of hunger in Kenya. That should not be, heard of. And it's just a matter of ensuring that we already know the weather patterns. How do we ensure that we are providing farmers with water? We're providing these farmers with enough inputs. We're ensuring that we also provide knowledge in terms of the changing seasons so that they are aware. Because a lot of the times also we find that our meteorological department sometimes mislead farmers, saying that it's going to rain, and the farmers go ahead and plant. But then it doesn't rain, and they lose their seeds. But more than that, I think also the kind of support really matters. For instance, if we say that we are giving the farmers fertilizers and there's no water, we still can't grow. So how do we ensure that we are giving them what is necessary for them to be able to grow in terms of supporting them? But let this support be meaningful. Let's also, in terms of you asked a question about how do women, come into this play. In terms of food security, women contribute, like this discussion really impact them, and they play a crucial role. We're talking about 80% of the food we consume coming from, these smallholder farmers. So we also need to ensure that they have a seat at the table. Dr. Kwaimbori,
in a moment, we'll get back to how then we ensure a swift transition from the current status to a just, equitable and away from fossil fuels and other contributory factors to the climate catastrophe. But when we 3 years ago held the devolution conference in Makueni County, back at home, it was themed multi-level governance for climate action. And because we have the devolved system of governance, then how do we descend down the conversation, even from the national government, and devolve it as well, that the counties can have allocated money to efforts in order to counter these consequences at the respective sub-county and the ward level, for the Kenyan people to be wholly part of this discussion, such that it isn't elitist or one that's happening in conferences across the world or in the African continent, but one that happens at their doorstep, and have an understanding of what needs to be done specifically so that they can find solutions.
So thank you so much for this question. And before I delve into this one on devolution, let me touch a little bit on agriculture, because there's a point here which was mentioned, and to be unfair of me or not to touch on that as an agriculture expert also. In the COP15 on biodiversity, because people are usually inclined on COP for the climate, there's COP for biodiversity. In COP15 on biodiversity, they mentioned that 60% of the remaining arable land in the world lies in Africa. That one tells you something. It tells you that if Africa, we take advantage of climate-smart agriculture, then we are able to actually provide food not only for Africa, but also for the world for a few decades. In that regard, there is a point she has mentioned in that women and women. The reason being that women and the youth are people who are regarded as vulnerable, even the elderly, when it comes to issues of agriculture and climate. So what we are doing, and maybe I'll try to mention because it will be to the benefit of the people there, is that we at KEPSA, we are organizing a training for agri-SMEs, which actually has a deadline for registration on 15th March 2024. So people just go to the platform, social media pages, they'll find that virtual and in-person training free of charge. And we are encouraging the women and the youth to participate in that agri-SME, because we're going to teach them the tools and the skills that pertain to actually making sure they produce, and they produce high-quality produce that will either bring profit to them, but at the same time make Kenya a food secure country. Okay. At the same time, to devolution conference in Makueni, yes, it's true that our main agenda was climate, and we looked into it as a turning point moving forward. I can't say that everything is bad about it. It was good, but what we see is the disbursement from the government in terms of these funds that the county governments are calling for. Yeah. Whenever the county governments don't get funds in time, then it means that they will have to reallocate money meant for either climate to pay salaries in the county, reallocate that money for climate to do other development projects that are not pertaining to that. But for counties to operationalize this climate fund and climate finance kit, which they have, which was part of our resolution when we were formulating the nationally determined contributions. And even counties came up with it. Most counties have their climate policy and act, which is a requirement for them to come up with the climate change fund and to access that money in the global north. So what we are saying is that counties which are remaining, of which I beg to differ, maybe there are very few, they should finish on this so that they can be able to access that money and stop that back and forth of asking the government for climate change and climate adaptation and mitigation and risk adaptation money, yet they can access it through the instruments they have. So what we are saying is that we need devolution to work, we need devolution to be respected moving forward, because if it is not supported fully, then we, the county governments, will be relying on the national government on simple issues such as coming up with a dam, a water harvesting procedure or something to climate-proof their counties. And we have seen counties in Kenya that have suffered drastically due to the recent floods and droughts, and yet they were calling on the government to help them, and yet they had access to their own money only if they had created these instruments, but some of them have not.
And Amos, coming to you on the climate change, which is contributing in humanitarian emergencies such as heat waves, wildfires, floods in our case, after the rains, tropical storms and hurricanes. Drought is basically lack of water. Then the rains came, we never harvested enough. We seem to be in a perpetual cycle of not taking advantage of even when it rains. Then at what level of cooperation do we need to set up reservoirs and mega dams that can store water in that when the drought period knocks on the door, then you have sufficient water, as you have said, to do irrigation and maintain the food supply, make us food secure? I mean, are we doing enough in terms of the infrastructure of our dams across the country?
Yeah, the thing is, I think we are living in extreme circumstances. And the reason why probably communities don't store water is when the rain comes, it's too heavy and they have to run for their safety and they are being driven out of the communities. But another thing that is happening is we're giving a lot of emphasis on decarbonization rather than helping communities adapt. And I think for communities in Kenya, if you ask them to reduce emissions, they will tell you we don't have emissions to reduce because they haven't contributed to the problem. But they need support to be able to build resilience to this problem. So Kenya is implementing a program called Financing Locally Led Climate Action. Although resources have not been going to communities on a timely manner. But that's a very good initiative that, if implemented properly, could help communities to be able to adapt to the challenges that they are facing. It has taken also the global community a very long time to come to a consensus around losses and damages that are being caused by the climate crisis. It was only agreed, actually, in Sharm el-Sheikh to have a loss and damage fund and operationalized last year with very little resources going into it. When you look at the damages that communities are facing, the losses that our communities are facing are very huge and sometimes very overwhelming for these communities to be able to overcome on their own. We need, like I've already mentioned, international cooperation and solidarity. We need resources coming from our international friends going into these communities. And there has to be mechanisms where these communities can directly access these resources without having to go through various steps before the resources get to them. Because some of these crises are emergency crises that need a very urgent and fast response. So if we can have mechanisms where communities can directly apply and get these resources to their communities and help them build resilience, I think that would be great. Another thing is about facilitating already existing local systems. For example, there are agricultural practices that communities have practiced in this country for a very long time that are agro-friendly. You realize that some of the challenges that we are having in the climate crisis is damaging ecosystems. We are losing our ecosystems, and that's why our communities are finding it very difficult to adapt because the systems that they used to depend on are being degraded. So if we can help these communities protect these systems that for a very long time they have relied on for their survival, we will be helping them to survive the climate crisis. One of the practices is agroecology, an agricultural practice that actually depends on the ecosystem for its thrival. So we are wasting a lot of resources in maybe misplacing our priorities. We need to work closely with communities so that they are able to articulate clearly what their needs are, and then we channel these efforts into directly meeting their needs.
All right. Helen, coming to you, UNEA in Nairobi showcased again why we need as a world to maintain the climate action clarion call, to amplify it even further. And interestingly, it's themed effective, inclusive and sustainable multilateral actions to tackle climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution. This theming is constantly a stakeholder reflection, more or less. But when it comes to the financing question, then, is it holistic? Does it have a point of convergence? Is it sufficient? Does it trickle down to the intended persons? And how can Kenya and Africa build the momentum on the UNEA conference that Nairobi hosted, just as it did with the Nairobi Climate Conference, into the next COP action to woo the globe?
Thank you, Ayub. And yes, at UNEA, the one thing that leaders have come to realize is that when you look at the climate crisis, when you look at pollution, when you look at biodiversity loss, including plastic pollution, these all culminate into a crisis that we need to pay attention to. And I'm glad that as we go through UNEA, we are seeing a lot of, feedback, especially from Kenya, giving into the process that this cannot wait. This needs to be tackled. And most leaders have come together. But again, we have experienced and we have witnessed, a few countries, and the same culprits, the big oil producers, coming down, trying to also derail or water down some of the resolutions that have been put forward. At the moment, there are 19 resolutions that have put forward in UNEA. Those are still being, negotiated, and a lot of that, the different issues. There is, solar radiation. There's issues to do with, chemical and waste, and others. And so the call here is for the member states that are usually in this negotiation, and specifically for UNEA, not to allow this, a few countries to water down this resolution because we are in a triple, planetary crisis here. And if you look at the climate crisis, if you look at plastics, and if you look at biodiversity loss, it all tells us that we need to act, and we need to act now. I think the time for talking is over. We are at a point where we need to see more action. We need to see, more commitments coming from our government. We're talking about the finances and the loss and damage, fund. The polluters need to pay, and they need to pay for the damages that they've caused all these years. But beyond that, I think we also need to look at how do we ensure that we are moving away from all these many talks, because having conferences, having big, meetings is good, but beyond that, what action is going to take place? And I think Kenya is also doing well in terms of making sure that we're not just talking, but we're also trying to implement some of these, policies. And I'll be biased here and just focus on if you look, for instance, in terms of the plastics, Kenya, for instance, instituted a ban in 2017 on, the plastic packaging, but we went ahead in 2020 and added another ban on all protected areas. So it's also a point where we're saying, look, we might be having teething problems in terms of implementing such policies, but it's good that we're already starting to see some of this implementation. And now we're at a point where we are discussing the possibility of a, international legally binding instrument, to curb plastic pollution. And I want to bring this point because the plastic crisis is driving climate crisis. So it's still the same struggle, that if we cap one bit, we're also in one way reducing the impacts of the climate crisis. Like I mentioned before, plastic production uses a lot of, fossil fuels in the extraction and across the entire, life cycle. So with all these big conferences going on, it has to come to a point where we are going beyond all this. And as we negotiate towards the international binding, plastic treaty, we call upon leaders to also ensure that they're supporting this. And we have good examples in our continent, Africa, where, we have countries such as Rwanda, countries such as Kenya, who are already, leading this call. And so we need to see more of that. We need to see more countries taking, showing more ambition in terms of fighting the plastic pollution, but also just calling for and negotiating for a treaty that will ensure we are moving away from not just plastic pollution, but looking at the entire, life cycle from production to use to disposal.
Okay. Dr. Koimburi, how meaningful will UNEA 6 be to Kenya and the continent and to the world?
Yeah, I see UNEA 6 as a turning point because one of the clarion calls that were being made, especially from the opening session, which was yesterday on the business forum, we saw the First Lady of the nation pointing out that circular economy is key, and also we need to see more collaborations between the private sector and all these investors in implementing all this agenda and moving forward. So people have now moved from strategy to action, trying to see how best can we be able to move from either unilateral or bilateral kind of engagements to multilateral kind of engagements, whereby we have more than 3 institutions coming together, either countries or nations, and having a platform where they can exchange ideas and having successful case studies that can be applied. So what I see here is that UNEA 6 will be a huge turning point, as long as now we have the necessary policies, of which the EPR 1 is there, the extended producer regulator is one, and others. So as long as we have policies, which are the instruments and the framework, then I don't see any reason why UNEA 6 will not succeed. And from the way things are going, for us to access all this money that has been set aside from COP28, the requirements have been set. Okay. We need to have all these frameworks, and it is up to us. So we as Africa, generally, not even Kenya, we should not be complaining that we're not able to access the money, because there are stipulations that we must meet. We must have this framework so that the money, when it comes in, it finds avenues, it finds a safeguard, because corruption is another big issue, so that this money, if it is meant for adaptation and mitigation, it is not diverted by any means. So I think UNEA 6, to me, is a huge turning point, and all I'm saying is that all stakeholders on board, we should be taking everything positively and look at the future in terms of it being bright. Okay,
but Dr. Koimburi, when you talk about the money going for the intended cause and intended activity, as a country we have made significant strides in terms of our environmental governance, including amendments to laws and regulations. I mean, how then is that possible? Does it, in other words, also on the flip end, expose our other side of being greedy and being corrupt? And how can that then further add up to already a layer of complexity where we are dealing with climate crisis, and the money intended might not end up going to the right people who are victims of the climate debate?
Yeah. So I think that one trickles down to respecting the rule of law and respecting the third arm of government, the legislature and the judiciary, which are there. And there's something that was mentioned here by my fellow colleagues, is that we need equity. And equity and also environmental sustainability cannot actually be attained if there is no justice. So what I'm saying is that we need to respect various environmental agencies and courts whenever they issue orders that pertain to either misappropriation of these funds or this. Because once we start having that movement of not respecting court orders, not respecting the laws and the instruments there and subverting it, then it becomes an issue. And when you look at most of the counties, we have this department or docket of finance, which also maybe looks into even the Department of Environment, which also has a financial controller who actually looks into the finance fund. Yes. So what we are saying is that they need to be respected, and we should be having safeguards so that the governors who are leading the counties, or even the president, they cannot give an order whereby that money, they can subvert it and use it and say, we'll replace it later. Because once we create that avenue, then that money will be used anyhow. Let that money be tamper-proof, so that the only way it can come out of that account, if it is going into a tangible project on the ground level. So I think the only thing is, let's respect the rule of law, and let's respect all these orders which are being issued, so that people can actually keep away from that money.
Yeah, Amos, coming to you, when we had the drought season, there was the fear of conflict because of the scarce resource. Then came flooding, and people moved from point A to point B, and the host in point B wouldn't want any people to be on their land. The question of, again, conflict from both ends. Had we had enough financing, would this be the case in terms of staving off such crisis in the face of climate conference?
Yeah, the thing is, I think we have solutions, and the challenge is how do we implement these solutions? And I already mentioned that we need to actually look within and see the potential that we have and mobilize locally, but also we need to seek international cooperation. You mentioned about UNEA and having such a multilateral processes. I think they are very important, that while leaders are coming together to discuss and try to find solutions to the challenges that we are faced with. But sometimes we have seen a common trend in these spaces where we have detractors coming in and trying to offer false solutions during these moments. One of these false solutions is issues around geoengineering, trying to geoengineer ourselves out of the challenges that we have. I don't think this is a space where our leaders need to get distracted. They need to focus and be able to look at finding solutions. And some of the solutions that should be coming out of this is a framework that clearly defines on how communities and countries that are faced with these crises are able to be facilitated to overcome these challenges. We have seen also other false solutions that come through transferring responsibility from polluters to actually the communities that are bearing the brand already of these challenges. Among them is the carbon markets, for example. You realize that these are schemes that are pegged on land. And we are already having challenges with the accessing resources, like you say, that are actually risking communities getting into conflicts. But we have schemes that are going to further undermine community land tenure by transferring responsibility of cutting emissions from the industries that have caused the challenge to the communities and their lands. The land that is already constrained by droughts, the land that is already constrained by floods, now being turned into a scheme that is not going to benefit these communities, but further put these communities on a vulnerable pathway. So we need to be careful with some of the solutions that are provided in these spaces, because some of these solutions, they do not help communities adapt, but they undermine even their adaptability. Like if you take away a land from pastoralists and try to plant trees on large scale to sell carbon credits, you are altering, first of all, the livelihood of this community. And that's all that they know. And this is what sustains them, even when the droughts come. But it's assumed that this is an empty land that needs to be used to plant trees to get credits and actually offset polluters at the expense of who? Who is at the loss?
So the need for engagement.
The need for engagement, but also to be cognizant of local context. To be cognizant that actually we cannot use the same tricks that have got us into this problem to get out of this problem. And these tricks are geoengineering, but also markets. Markets have failed us.
Okay. Helen, then how much of an emphasis is needed, for example, on the reforming of the global financial system to help the countries that are bearing the consequence, for example, the consequences, the African continent, I mean, looking at it from the entire perspective, how much of an emphasis at the moment is on the talk about the reforming of the global financial system? So
if you look at, for instance, at UNEA right now, there's not much emphasis on the, how does this then trickle to the people who need it the most. There's the mention that, yes, and they mention an acknowledgement that, yes, we need, to put these resources together. We need, financial support. We need, a fund, a loss and damage fund. that is there, but in terms of how do we actually actualize the implementation, that is still, up in the air. And I think that needs to also, take really a priority in terms of these negotiations, and not just at UNEA, but even going into the next COP later this year, because it's one thing to say, well, we have set up a loss and damage fund, but when it comes to how does that then, translate into, that farmer in Marsabit, or somewhere, who is now facing the actual consequences of the climate crisis. We need to see that happening. And Koimburi mentioned about how do we ensure that that fund is also protected, because there are issues of, yes, we can say this is fund that is has been allocated for X and Y, but then in the, on the ground, things are a little bit different. And this is where we also speak about, national implementation plans being really key, because at the end of the day, we could have the fund, we could have the money, but if the implementation plan is lacking or is missing or is not really steady, then we will still not be able to have these funds get to the people that deserve it the most.
Dr. Koimburi, then talk to me about the ensuring of accountability and transparency in pursuit of a just and equitable transition from the perspective of now the African continent and the African countries.
If I get it right, is maybe on my end is the aspect of insurance. Maybe if I bring the aspect of insurance on this point is we have seen one of the key areas of the adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation mostly is insurance. And one thing that people who are in the agricultural sector are actually suffering from is the lack of insurance. Most of the insurance companies have been shying away from insuring calamities which are linked to climate. But nowadays they are moving towards that. And I'm happy to say that we are working with close insurance firms that are actually now looking into how they can be able to provide that insurance cover to a farmer who loses livestock. Remember, we lost millions of livestock during the drought, which we experienced for a very long time. After 40 years, we lost so many millions of cattle. But if we had insurance on board, then these farmers then would actually be going back to their normal livelihoods. Most of them, they have actually gone to a worse state. They had children they were taken to school. They were depending on those cattle, which have also a symbolic value, which have a value in terms of even a marriage. Some of them use these cattle as dowry. And that's why you are seeing there are so many conflicts which are associated with climate. We are now seeing banditry attacks. We are seeing attacks, raids occurring, especially when there is a climate calamity. People looking for resources in neighboring counties, people who have lost cattle and they need to marry, and they are told, for you to marry, you must have cattle. And they know the easiest way to get cattle is from their neighbors. So also moving forward, we need to look into the nexus and research more into climate and conflict and see how best that one comes out. There's a research I did. I was part of a program in South Sudan where we were looking at climate and conflict nexus as an issue of nature-based, of natural resources. And this is something also we need to look into that much further also in Kenya. And what I'm saying is that all these talks that we are doing, we have done enough research. All these institutions, they have done it. They are doing something on plastic. We have done something on plastic. We have done something on circular economy. But now we need to move away from all this research. We have so many reports which are getting dust somewhere. What we need to do right now is let's get partners from the global north that are responsible for this pollution that we're talking about. They come in, they invest, and you see how we can be able to uplift the lives of the people at the grassroots level, as opposed to only giving them boardroom meetings, which are not helping out. But all in all is that the Paris Agreement moving to COP29, even moving to COP29, we want to see COP29 as a meeting whereby we will be meeting to say, we have done this. And it has helped 10,000 people, 15,000 people, families have been uplifted, as opposed to coming up with theories that are not working. Let COP29 be assessing, a monitoring and evaluation kind of platform.
Okay, Amos, then talking about what he said, for example, the livelihoods and which sustain economies of persons across the country, for example, pastoralism, farming, is it Is time ripe for a discussion on diversification?
Exactly. I think we are in a time where communities need to understand that actually we are running out of resources locally, and it's time to diversify. And that's why having a proper policy that will allow these communities to participate in the full value chain and not just at the producers level, where they are able now to add value. For example, pastoralists are able to add value to the meat that they produce and participate in the wider value chain. I think that is going to help them to adapt. Also, processing of farmers' produce, so that they increase the shelf life of their produce. You realize that most of the losses from our communities is because they lack the necessary equipments and technology to be able to extend the shelf life. For example, when they produce tomatoes, they have to get to the market immediately. The roads are not good. They do not have those cooling systems. I think it's time we invested in systems that are going to help our communities to extend the shelf life, but also participate in the full value chain of their production activities. We also need to invest in improving infrastructure, so that there is a quick and interconnection between the market and the producers. You find that there is that disconnect between producers and markets, and this leads also to more vulnerability among our communities, because to be able to move, for example, produce from rural areas to urban centers, sometimes it becomes a problem because of extreme weather events. When it rains, the roads become impassable. So it's important that as we invest in systems to support our communities to adapt, we also think about investing in a durable infrastructure. Not just any infrastructure, because in this city we have seen where roads are built, and then when the rains come, they become impassable immediately. So we need to start, even when we are developing our infrastructure, to have these extreme weather events in mind, so that we are building infrastructures that are able to withstand climate risks.
Yeah, okay. Helen, the idea of picking up on what Amos had said, of the establishments of the county aggregation centers, how important are they in terms of value addition, providing storage facilities that are required in order to have to be a part of the conversation around food security? Because at the moment that isn't the reality.
Yeah, and I think the issue here is how do we then ensure that those farmers are well protected from not just the impacts, but also whatever little, whatever much that they produce. And when you speak about diversifying or, having this in their local context or counties, then it makes more sense, because it means that if a farmer produces, a farmer has produce, they don't have to worry about how do they get that to Nairobi. And this will really be key in terms of, getting enough storage facilities, for instance, ensuring that we have, good infrastructure. And also, in a way, this will also, boost the economy of the counties, because not everything that is produced in those local counties will need to be transported somewhere else, and it remains in the county. And if we add value to this produce, then we are able to also support the farmers to even produce more, because there's one thing about, not having food, but there's another thing about having food and looking at that food rotting. And sometimes it has been the case where we have a lot of, for instance, potatoes that we don't even have enough cold chains to store that. So it's really key that we have, adequate storage facilities, but also facilities to, add value and ensure that the farmers are supported to do that.
And Dr. Koimburi, then, given what you have talked about before I sample the feedback and see whether there's questions as well for you, Nairobi COP28, and then now we'll be having COP29. We also are having a problem locally of our forest cover and doing what needs to be done back at home here. And how can we build also the momentum on that on our part, as part of the responsibility we ought to be undertaking as an individual member state of the continent?
Thank you for that. In terms of forestry, is one of the it's a nature-based solution that we call the low-hanging fruits, because it's not expensive compared to other methods of carbon sequestration. So when it comes to the use of the planting of trees, what we advocate for essentially is planting trees that the farmers can benefit from. If you ask a farmer to plant a tree that he himself will see it has occupied his piece of land and is not benefiting, is an issue. So here we're talking about the planting of even fruit trees, whereby the farmer can plant a tree and at the same time can be able to harvest the crops, the fruits out of it, and at the same time the tree is doing the work of carbon sequestration. So what we are seeing in terms of the government effort and the agenda they have of planting, I think, is it 10 billion trees by 2020 what? Yeah. 2032 or something. But this is an agenda that we are seeing positively, and with the carbon markets coming up, because now I've seen the Ministry of Environment has set up instruments and all this to enable the carbon markets to flourish, then people will be able to be paid to actually not cut down your trees and keep them alive. So we are seeing an aspect of people earning and getting jobs from these trees, from people who are having tree seedlings. They'll be selling the tree seedlings, and then once the trees grow to that mature level, then they'll be paid carbon credits for them to ensure those trees are actually left alone in that manner. So the planting of trees is a good effort, and I saw this this week, I think it was yesterday, where the First Lady was involved in planting trees at Karura. So this is an effort that we are saying that should be emulated by everybody. Let also the Ministry of Education come up with a curriculum that embeds the issue of tree planting and tree growing as an issue that inculcates the students from a lower level, so that whenever they grow, they find that tree planting is actually the norm.
Thank you. Let's now sample the feedback. The hashtag on X is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Here's what you're saying on our handle. The first one from Remy Butia says Kenya can achieve climate positive development and be part of the global climate solution by infusing climate change considerations into the management of its natural assets, positioning its human capital to be resilient to climate change. Unnamed says climate change kill food production. Funding should be deliberate to save our future, do away with housing, focus on climate resilient farming. Dependence on foreign funds will make the problem permanent, like teenage pregnancies. Bob Otieno Wino says time is running out because we are not ready yet to adapt to climate change during, for example, floods and drought periods. Next one is KRK_Wizard. Addressing climate change requires a collective commitment to ambitious and sustained action at all levels of society. While the challenges are daunting, the opportunities for innovation, collaboration and positive change are also significant. Remy Butia says low carbon and climate resilient investments are key to Kenya's inclusive and sustainable future. The government and the private sector have an important role to play through deployment of capital in climate resilience and sustainable job creation. I give you the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think we are in a situation, but that does not mean that we can't get out of this situation. Like we already discussed, I think if we all of us come together and with a common collective goal of finding solutions, I don't think there's anything that can defeat us. So it's up to us and African leaders to come together and develop a common position and a common pathway that is going to get Africa out of its challenges. And this should be owned by the people. It should be a people's agenda.
Thank you.
And maybe to add on the same, there's a point you have raised on housing, which I wanted to come back to. Somebody has said we should do away with housing and concentrate on climate. I wanted to maybe educate the person in that housing is helping to reduce the issue of land fragmentation and the rest, because people now will be housed in one area as opposed to be having parcels of land you're building and then you have a lot of land which is empty, because that land now will be used for agriculture, because the issue now in Kenya is we don't have that luxury of land. So housing is part of the urban planning that will help to reduce climate change issues.
Yes, Helen.
African leaders need to reimagine and rethink a future that is powered by renewable energy, a future that will not have fossil fuel, or one that will ensure that our communities are not suffering from these dire consequences of the climate crisis.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, your time is all appreciated. I thank you for your company here. Dr. Jackson Koimburi is Senior Circular Economy and Climate Change Coordinator at the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. Good morning. Your time is appreciated. Helen Dena is the project lead upon Africa Plastic Projects, the Greenpeace Africa. Thank you. Much appreciated. And Amos Wemanya is Senior Climate Policy Advisor at PowerShift Africa. Your time is all appreciated. Many thanks for coming on board. Thanks to you too for waking up with us here on Daybreak. The hashtag on X has been Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdulkadir. We'll see you on Friday here on the broadcast. Till then, good morning.